Alcatraz, the rock. I mean, it's practically synonymous with those chilling prison stories, right? We all know that image, that fog-shrouded island, that ominous prison against the San Francisco skyline.
Iconic.
But you sent us a whole stack of sources about Alcatraz, and they hint at, well, something else going on, something
Oh,
paranormal.
okay. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Get this. Even before the prison closed in '63, there were already rumors of haunting.
Really? Even while it was still running?
Yeah. Wild, right. What do you think about that?
That's pretty interesting. I mean, Alcatraz is drenched in history, but it seems like those cold, hard facts have gotten tangled up with something a bit spookier.
Right. So for anyone who maybe needs a quick refresher, Alcatraz wasn't always that supermax prison.
Right.
I mean, it started as a military fort back in the mid-1800s. Then it was a military prison.
Yep.
And then it became the infamous federal penitentiary we see in movies, back in 1934. But even those early years, I mean, they were pretty harsh.
Yeah, absolutely. Just being isolated on the island, that contributed to the whole feeling of being locked up.
Yeah.
But it was when it became a federal penitentiary that it was meant to be like a truly inescapable fortress.
Right.
They sent the most notorious criminals there, guys like Al Capone, George, Machine Gun Kelly.
Oh, yeah. Big names.
Yeah.
And for the most part, it worked, right? I mean, you had those freezing bay waters,
Right.
constant surveillance, and just that psychological weight of being isolated.
It all adds up.
It's like a recipe for despair, right?
Yeah.
You'd think in a place that controlled rumors of paranormal stuff wouldn't even start, but they did. And even while the prison was open,
It is strange. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, it's weird.
Well, think about the kind of energy that must have been all over Alcatraz.
Yeah?
We're talking about a place where violence wasn't just a possibility, it was an everyday thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the sources you sent, they talk about suicides, inmates killing each other, and the brutal treatment of those in solitary confinement. I mean, it's not hard to imagine that such intense negative energy would leave some kind of mark.
No, it's not. And what I find so creepy is that story about cell 14D. I mean, that wasn't just solitary confinement. That was like the whole
Oh, wow.
total darkness,
Oh, God.
complete isolation. And one of the sources actually described an inmate's experience in that cell. Whispers, screams, and like a terrifying creature with glowing eyes. It's like something out of a nightmare, right? And the poor guy, he was found dead the next morning, fear just etched on his face. I mean, it's hard to just dismiss that as an overactive imagination.
Right, right. I mean, that story about Cell 14D is one of the most famous ones from Alcatraz.
Oh, for sure.
But what's really interesting is that it kind of connects to a bigger idea you found in your research, this concept of residual energy.
Yeah.
I mean, could all that suffering in that cell and throughout Alcatraz, could it have left behind some kind of psychic residue?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? It's hard to ignore. And it's not just Cell 14D either, right? There's like a whole bunch of supposedly paranormal hotspots on Alcatraz, like the Warden's house. It's abandoned now, but people say they see shadowy figures, hear unexplained footsteps. It's giving me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah. What's really interesting about the Warden's house is that it adds a whole other layer to the Alcatraz story. I mean, we always focus on the prisoners, but the staff and their families live there too.
Right, right.
You know, that source you found about the warden's wife,
Yeah.
she experienced some strange stuff too. It seems like whatever energy is there on Alcatraz, it wasn't limited to just the prison itself.
And then there's the dining hall. History tells us that riots and confrontations happened all the time there.
Oh, yeah.
And now visitors, they report hearing voices, dishes clattering, sudden cold drafts. Makes you wonder if it's like echoes from the past, like some audio recording of the violence that happened there.
Right. The dining hall is a great example of how the way Alcatraz is built might play a role in people thinking it's haunted.
Oh.
I mean, the high ceilings and the big open space, it could totally distort sounds, amplify them,
Yeah.
and make them seem kind of otherworldly, you know?
Okay, yeah. And we can't forget the utility corridor, right? That's where the brutal Battle of Alcatraz went down in 1946.
Right.
That escape attempt, it failed, and several people died.
Oh, man.
And now people say they feel this oppressive presence there. They hear unexplained noises, almost like the violence is kind of burned into the space itself. It's enough to make you want to sleep with the lights on.
You know what strikes me about the utility corridor is that it was a place of not just violence, but also, like, desperate hope.
Yeah.
I mean, those inmates who tried to escape, they were risking everything just for a chance at freedom.
Yeah.
I wonder, could that combination of desperation and violence have left some kind of mark?
Right.
I mean, it definitely adds another dimension to all these stories, doesn't it?
Right. It does. And so we've got these individual stories, specific locations, but then there's this bigger question you brought up, this idea of a Native American curse on Alcatraz.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
I mean, long before it was a prison, indigenous tribes used the island as a place of exile, you know?
Right.
And some people believe they put a curse on it, like they doomed it to be this place of suffering and unrest.
It's a pretty compelling piece of the puzzle, right? It adds this sense of tragedy to the island's history like it was meant to be.
Yeah, totally.
And if we look at the timeline, from the Native Americans to the military years and finally to the federal penitentiary, it's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Like the island was always destined to be this dark place.
Yeah, I know what we mean.
So we're back digging even deeper into the mysteries of Alcatraz.
We've covered a lot, right?
We have. Chilling stories, those supposed paranormal hotspots, even that whole idea of a Native American curse hanging over the island.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in this residual energy thing. You know, you included quite a few sources that talk about it.
Yeah, it's something that really stood out to me too. It's almost like the island itself is like this giant sponge just soaking up all that negativity from the past, you know?
Right.
The violence, the despair, all that isolation. Could it be trapped there? Like replaying itself over and over, some kind of ghostly echo.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it?
Indeed.
And what's interesting is that this idea of residual energy, it's not just an Alcatraz thing. It comes up a lot in paranormal research across different cultures.
Really?
Yeah. Places where there have been really intense emotional events, battlefields, places of tragedy. They often become known for hauntings and stuff we just can't explain. It's like the emotions themselves get imprinted on the place.
One of the sources you sent, it talks about this theory that residual energy might be connected to electromagnetic fields.
Oh, interesting.
Apparently, strong emotions can cause changes in these fields, and those changes could be recorded by the environment, like somehow.
It sounds kind of sci-fi, doesn't it?
Yeah, but there's some pretty interesting research out there about it.
It definitely seems like something worth looking into more.
Yeah.
And it could maybe explain why certain spots on Alcatraz, like Cell 14D or the dining hall, seem to have more activity than others. I mean, if those were places where there were a lot of strong emotional outbursts, it's possible those electromagnetic recordings, if you will, are stronger there.
Right, that makes sense. Thinking back to that story about the inmate in cell 14D, the one who saw that creature with the glowing eyes.
Yeah, creepy.
I wonder if what he experienced was some kind of manifestation of that residual energy that's trapped in there, maybe his own fear combined with the energy that was already in that cell. It kind of amplified everything.
It's definitely a possibility. And it brings up another thing about residual energy that your sources mentioned, that our own emotions can affect how we experience these paranormal things.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, if we're already feeling anxious or scared, we might be more likely to pick up on little changes in energy or interpret something we see or hear as something scarier than it actually is.
That's a good point. Like when people say they feel uneasy or scared when they first get to Alcatraz, even before they've seen or heard anything weird, could that be because they're already expecting something creepy to happen?
Absolutely. Our expectations, even the ones we don't realize we have, they can really shape how we experience things. And let's not forget the influence of pop culture either.
Yeah, true.
I mean, we've all seen the movies, read the books, heard those stories about Alcatraz being haunted. It's almost impossible to go there without all that in your head shaping how you see things.
Speaking of pop culture, it's kind of crazy to think about how Hollywood has shaped our fascination with Alcatraz. You know, movies like Escape from Alcatraz, The Rock, they give you this really specific image of the island. It's all suspense and the supernatural and...
It's a perfect example of how truth and fiction can get mixed up in our minds, right? Those movies, they take some liberties with the real-life stories.
Yeah.
They make things a bit more exciting for the audience, you know? But they also add to the mystery of Alcatraz.
Yeah, totally.
They make us think it's this place where real and unreal kind of blend together.
It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about Alcatraz is actually true, and how much is Hollywood making stuff up.
That's the tricky part.
Yeah.
Trying to separate the myths from the real stories. And that's what makes Alcatraz such a fascinating subject to really dive into.
For sure.
It's a place that makes us think about what we believe, you know?
Yeah.
What's real, what's not, what's out there that we just don't understand.
Okay, I gotta ask, what about the skeptics? The people who say all this ghost stuff is just nonsense, that there's a simple explanation for everything, like psychology or something about the environment. What about them?
Well, being skeptical is important, you know. It makes us think critically and question what we believe. And the skeptics do make some good points. Alcatraz is a pretty isolated island, exposed to the weather and all.
Right.
Strange acoustics, weird shadows, the fact that the buildings are decaying, all that could easily make it feel eerie and spooky.
Plus, there's that whole thing about if everyone's telling you a place is haunted, you're more likely to hear every creak and groan as a ghost.
Exactly. Our minds are really powerful. They can trick us into seeing and hearing things that aren't really there.
Yeah, for sure.
But even with all that in mind, there are still a bunch of stories from Alcatraz that are hard to explain away. Stories that have been told by multiple people who saw the same thing, or experiences that really stayed with people.
Yeah.
And it's those stories that keep the whole debate going.
Yeah, it keeps us interested.
It's what makes us so fascinated by Alcatraz, you know?
It's interesting. Alcatraz has become this kind of cultural symbol for everything paranormal. It's not just a historical place. It represents the unknown, the mysteries we can't quite figure out. It's almost like it represents our fear of the dark, of what might be hiding out there.
I think you've got something there. Alcatraz, even with all its darkness and mystery, it reminds us that even with all our technology and our knowledge, there are still things we can't explain, things we can't control. And I think that's why we're still so drawn to this island.
You know, we've talked a lot about the prison itself, all the stories about the inmates and the paranormal stuff. But you also sent some sources that focus on the human side of Alcatraz.
Right.
The families who lived there, the kids who grew up with the prison looming over them.
It's an important part of the story.
What can you tell us about what it was like for them?
It's pretty crazy to think about. Imagine living on an island that's basically just a maximum security prison. To know that right outside your door are some of the most dangerous criminals in the country.
I can't even imagine. Not your typical childhood.
Not at all. The families who lived on Alcatraz, they had to adjust to a really unique and challenging way of life. There were strict rules, constant security checks, and you were always aware of how isolated you were.
Yeah, it must have been tough.
But even with all that, they built a community there. They found a sense of normalcy in this really bizarre place.
One of the sources you sent, it mentioned that the kids who grew up on Alcatraz, they actually felt a sense of freedom that most kids wouldn't understand.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they could wander around the island, explore those abandoned buildings, and have their own adventures. It's almost like being surrounded by this prison actually gave them a sense of independence and resilience.
It's a strange contrast, isn't it? The confinement of the prison, creating a space for this unexpected freedom. And it shows how adaptable humans are, how we can find joy and connection in the weirdest places.
It makes you think that maybe the stories of Alcatraz, the history and the paranormal stuff, maybe they're about more than just fear and being locked up. Maybe they're also about hope and resilience and how powerful human connections can be.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. Alcatraz, with all its darkness and mystery, it reminds us that even when things are tough, the human spirit finds a way to keep going and even thrive.
We've really gotten into the spooky side of Alcatraz.
Yeah.
But I keep coming back to the people who live there. Not the famous criminals,
Right.
but the families.
Yeah.
The kids who actually called Alcatraz home.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to imagine what that must have been like.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's this island, everyone thinks of it as like the ultimate symbol of being locked up and isolated.
Yeah.
But there were families living there, kids growing up.
Yeah.
One of the sources you sent, it talks about a former resident who described Alcatraz as having this weird,
Oh, okay.
like a darkness and
Yeah.
a light.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, there's this huge, imposing prison with some of the most dangerous criminals in the country.
Yep.
But on the other hand, you have families trying to live normal lives.
Right.
Kids making friends, dealing with all the usual stuff of growing up.
And it's those everyday things that we kind of forget about when we talk about Alcatraz.
Yeah, that's true.
Those stories from the families, they give us a whole different way of looking at the island. It wasn't just about crime and punishment.
Yeah.
It was a place where people lived, they loved, they made memories.
One of the things that really stood out to me in your research was how the kids who grew up on Alcatraz, they often felt this sense of freedom.
Really.
Yeah, freedom that most kids wouldn't understand. They could run around the island, explore those old buildings, go on their own adventures.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like being surrounded by that prison actually made them more independent and resilient.
That's fascinating, isn't it? The prison, which is all about confinement, somehow creating a space for freedom.
Yeah.
It shows how adaptable humans are, how we can find a way to make things normal, even in the most extraordinary situations.
There's definitely an irony there, right? This island, built to lock up some of the toughest criminals.
Yeah.
It also ended up being a place where kids had these adventures and a community grew.
It just shows how complex we are as humans, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even in the most unlikely places, we find ways to connect, to find meaning, to find joy.
Yeah.
It adds a whole other layer to what Alcatraz is all about.
Right.
It's not just a symbol of crime and punishment.
Right.
It's also a testament to how strong the human spirit is.
So after all this, after going deep into Alcatraz, the history, the paranormal stuff, the human stories, what's the main thing you hope our listeners take away from it?
I think it's that Alcatraz is more than just an island, more than just a prison. It's a symbol.
Okay.
A symbol of isolation, of how resilient people can be, of all those mysteries that are right there at the crossroads of history and the paranormal. It's a place that keeps capturing our imaginations, makes us question what we believe, and reminds us that sometimes it's hard to tell what's real and what's not.
Absolutely.
That line can be blurry.
Well, if anyone ever gets the chance to visit Alcatraz, I'd say go beyond the usual tourist stuff.
Yeah.
Take some time to think about the people who live there, the prisoners, the guards, the families. Their stories are part of Alcatraz.
They are.
Just waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe you'll even feel that chill.
Yeah.
That sense of something you can't see right there beside you.
Ooh, spooky.
Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Alcatraz has this power, you know?
Yeah.
It's this place where history and mystery come together.
It's true.
It's chilling.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Alcatraz.
It's been fun.
It's been a trip into the darkness, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also been a reminder of how strong we are as humans.
Right?
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions.
Yeah.
And remember, sometimes the best stories are the ones where you can't quite tell what's real and what's not.
That's the good stuff.